weeks ago, we kicked off a new series, a series that we are in during this season of Lent, a series that we've called Sacred Space. And I just want to lay a little foundation for us again as to where we've been. It'll be brief. And as always, I'm going to say this again in a little bit. If you had to miss any of these first three, I encourage you go online, listen in to where we've been. I think it's significant stuff as we think about what we're talking about. But let me just toss out a couple of things from weeks 1, 2, and 3. Week 1, we laid the foundation for this entire series by saying this, and I hope this resonates with you again. And if you missed week 1, this is our foundation. We said, in all of our lives, there is a place, there is a space where some tough things reside, right? Our struggles, our hurt, our pain, our frustrations, our anger, our sins, our resentment. We've all got those things in our lives. Doesn't make us bad. It's a part of our human journey. And we said when it comes to that particular place, can you blame us? Oftentimes we don't want to enter into that place. We don't want to deal with those things. We don't want to talk about those things. We don't even want to bring those things to God, maybe shame, maybe fear, whatever. But week 1, as we laid this foundation, we said this as well. Much as we don't want to deal with those things, if we avoid that space, if we fail to enter into it faithfully, consistently, then that old wilderness that we've called it is going to get so thick, it's going to be hard for us to get in there, let alone trying to clear space for God in that place. So having laid that foundation, we come to weeks 2 and 3 and say, okay, if it's not an option to avoid that place, right? If we're going to have a healthy relationship with God and an abundant life, a strong life, the life God would have for us, if we can't avoid that place in our lives and still have all of that, then what do we need to do? What do we need to do in order to be more motivated to enter in, just feeling more comfortable entering into that place? And we said weeks 2 and 3, couple of things that are critical. May I take off my mask for a moment? I totally spaced. This is going to feel good. Thank you for the pause. You're still with me, right? So we said a couple of things can really help us with this. I think you're going to remember these if you've been a part of this as we talk about them. Week 2, we said the heart is so important when it comes to being willing to enter into the wilderness and clear space for God there. Meaning, there are a lot of things in life that close our heart off from God. And if we're not paying attention, we won't even notice them. And if we are paying attention a lot of times, we don't know what to do. So week 2, I'll say, listen, and if you weren't here, week 2, we said, okay, here are 4 things especially that we got to look out for, that we've got to work on when our hearts close off from God, that they might be fully open to Him. Open to Him so that what? So that we might enter into the wilderness, clear space for Him there, have a better life. But then week 3, we said, okay, in addition to having open hearts, how about these Lenten practices we've talked about, these spiritual practices we've talked about? Another thing that's critical, if we're going to be able to clear space in the wilderness on a consistent basis, is making those spiritual practices, right? Bible study, quiet time with God, stronger prayer life, serving others. We said week 3 that if we're going to truly, again, be able to better, more consistently clear space for God in our wilderness, those things can't be on a checklist. I worshiped today, read my Bible this morning. Instead, remember the word we used last week, rhythm. Instead, those things just have to be something we get into a rhythm with, the rhythm of Bible study, the rhythm of loving neighbor. Those things just have to begin to be a part of who we are in order to, again, more consistently enter into the wilderness, clear space for God there. And so having talked about those specific things over the last few weeks, here's where we turn our attention today, and this is fun. Today we turn our attention to this, to the new growth that is beginning to take place in the midst of our wilderness because of the work we've done over these last 3 weeks. Or today we want to turn our attention to got to get into our wilderness. Here's what can help us get into it. Today we turn our attention from that to this, the growth, the new growth that God is making possible for us because we've allowed him in. Now, knowing that we want to focus on that new growth today, and I hope that's as exciting for you as it is for me, how cool to look at, again, specifically what God is doing in us, even in a difficult place. Are you with me? Having said that, though, let me say this initially. Here's why it's so important for us to look for that new growth as soon as it begins to spring up. Because initially, it's going to come to us in small portions. We might think of seedlings, right? And knowing that that growth is going to come, let's say, as a seedling, what needs to happen? Man, we need to notice it so we can nurture it, so we can care for it, because it needs that, especially needs that care and nurture early on, right? When I was growing up, my grandma Harding lived on the other side of town, just outside the city limits. And because she lived on about 1.5 acres, she always had, until later years, she always had this massive garden, and I mean massive garden. Growing all kinds of vegetables. And while, yes, at times there were corn stalks there when that was the appropriate time for them to be growing, she also grew so much else. But here's what she knew. Whether she started with a seed or a seedling, what was always going to be the case was this. She knew this. That when that plant was really, really young, when it was really, really small, she knew she needed to especially pay attention to it then, because it needed her most in those early times, the nurture, the care. It's the same for us. Recognize that today. So here's our challenge. To be able to see that growth in us as soon as it begins to spring up, so that we might begin to nurture it, so that we might begin to care for it. And so knowing how critical that is and the time we have together today, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at a couple of things that can help us to see that new growth. We're going to take a look at a couple of things, core things that can help us to notice that new growth when God is bringing it into our hearts, again, because we've cleared space for him. Here are the two things. As you reflect on that today, this week, hope you'll do that. Know that there are some reflection sheets, sermon notes online. Some of you printed them out ahead of time. If you didn't, print them out when you get home. Begin to reflect today and this week on, where is there new growth in me? And to discover that new growth, focus on these two things. These two things can help you. Here's the first. First, one sign that new growth is taking place in your life, in the midst of your wilderness even. One sign that that's taking place is when you find this within you, a desire to do something new, or a desire, we might even say, to do something more than you've ever done before. In the book of Isaiah, we find Isaiah talking about this a bit, and we find that in chapter 43, verses 18 and 19. If any of you want to turn there, Isaiah 43, verses 18 and 19 is what we're going to take a look at. Here's our first core passage today. Give a listen. Isaiah 43, verses 18 and 19, the prophet says this: "Do not remember the former things, or consider the things of old." In essence, he's saying initially, one sign of new growth in us is that we can let go of a past that bogs us down. We can let go of, put behind us, those things that maybe didn't work for us in the past. Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. And then hear this. Now it springs forth, present tense, right? Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness. You have got to love those words. Do you not perceive it? I think that speaks to all of us where we are oftentimes, even though God is growing us. Do you not perceive it? Reminds us, A, there is growth there, and we need to look for it. But B, it reminds us of this. If we don't take the time to look for it, if we don't recognize that new growth, then we can't nurture it at a very young stage. We can't care for it in the ways it needs to be cared for. Guys, if we know that in the midst of the clearings we've created in our wilderness, again, we're clearing that space for God there. If we know that in those places, God absolutely has begun to do a new work in us, if we know that, then one way we can begin to notice that better is this, to ask this question: is there in us a desire to do something new? Is there in us a desire to do something different or something more? And as you ask yourself that question, get specific. Those of you who printed out the guide ahead of time, I think you're going to find on the sheet, if that's any of you watching online, I think I used the word specifically 3 times. I think that's the case. Because if you're following along, if you say, okay, is there any new growth in me? I don't want you to say maybe. I don't want you to say, I think so. It might be, right? I'm pretty sure. Be specific. Name it that you might truly see that new growth, claim it, and nurture it. Give thanks for it, right? For example, if you've never chosen to get involved in a Bible study, Sunday school class, small group of some kind, if you have never done that before, and right now, after just these 3 weeks, 4 weeks into Lent, you're thinking, you know what? I really want to do that. First time in my life, I desire to get involved in a group like that with others. I promise you, if you're feeling that points you to what? New growth in you. That which God is growing in you, in that clearing you've created for Him. Or if you've never really thought about serving others before, you may feel this in your heart. You don't want to share it with a friend, but maybe you never wanted to before, right? And now you're thinking, oh, I'd like to really devote my life in large measure to serving for those who need help, right? If that's the case, what does that point you to? New growth within you. New growth that God is creating in that clearing. Or even if maybe, and I shouldn't say even if maybe, because this is big, even if you're just finding yourself more and more wanting to adjust your values, wanting to adjust your priorities. Again, maybe for the first time in your life, you're thinking, of course those things need to be like Jesus's, right? Man, if that's the case, what does that point you to? Wish I could just have you say it now. Points you to new growth. As a pastor, truly one of the most meaningful things that I can ever experience in ministry. And I guarantee you, the 3 retired pastors we have here, I haven't talked to them about it, don't need to, I know they'd say the same. Josh, youth director, Laura, children and family director, haven't talked to them about this, I know they would say the same thing. One of the most beautiful things I can ever experience in ministry as a pastor is this: not just witnessing someone come to Christ, not just witnessing someone for the first time kind of commit their lives to this Lord and Savior, as powerful as that is, it then is equally amazing to watch those who made that commitment. Now they want to do something new immediately, right? I mean, they are pumped up. They want to go at it. They want to do something more with their life like that. And what does that point to? You know, not just the gift of God's grace touching their heart in Christ, not just the gift of the new life they've embraced, but they're understanding that with that new growth, of course, is going to lead them to new behavior, new things, powerful, wonderful things, God working through them that they want to take on. Isaac Newton once said, everything continues in a state of rest unless it is compelled to change by forces impressed upon it. And one of the great gifts of what we've been talking about in this series so far, clearing space for God, not just in our lives, but in the toughest space in our lives. One of the great gifts that comes along with that always is this motivation to change, this motivation to, this desire to do a new thing. So first today, when you see that in you, when you recognize that new growth within, that new growth springing up within you because you've cleared space for God in your life, when you recognize that, again, begin to nurture it, begin to care for it, knowing it needs that and knowing that's just going to grow you all the more. Do you feel a desire to do a new thing that points you to that new growth? As you see that, begin to nurture that. Now, that being one sign that new growth is taking place in you, here's a second sign of that. A second indication that that's happening is this: when you find within you also an increase in your capacity to love, when you find within you an expansion of your desire to love. Or maybe we should say it this way, really tapping into what we talked about last week, rhythm in the midst of our loving others, right? We know that some new growth has occurred in us, not just when we feel like our capacity to love has expanded, but also when we might say, it just becomes a natural thing to do. No matter what we face, someone loving us back or someone hurting us, there's a rhythm in our loving others that just becomes, again, not checking off a to-do list. It's just who we are. In Jesus' day, there was a group of people. They were the teachers of the law. One of the fun things that they liked to do was to take the law and to kind of move away from what God intended it to be and to actually use it to pervert even things like loving others, right? And I think they knew what they were doing. I think they wanted to be judgmental. They wanted to exclude people. They wanted it to be kind of this narrow club that they were a part of, narrow group that God loved. I think they knew what they were doing. And yet Jesus, as only Jesus could, answered a question one day when a teacher of the law came to him. Would have been wonderful if they would have gotten it at that point, even that one teacher. Teacher of the law from this group comes to him and in essence asks him to define, say more about what love really is. And then even more so, what did he want to know? He wanted to know, in essence, do I have to love everybody? Right? Who do I really need to love? So offering that question to Jesus, here's Jesus' response. Luke chapter 10, again, if you want to follow along, Bibles, cell phone, Luke chapter 10, we're going to start with verse 25, Good Samaritan. Luke chapter 10, verses 25 and 37. Again, this is Jesus' way of saying, you're trying to ask me to narrow down what loving others looks like. Let me tell you a story. See if you can get it. Luke 10, 25 to 37. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? Jesus replied, how do you read it? The man answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. How hard is that? Is that pretty straightforward? Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side as well. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, look after him, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you might have. He concludes as he shares with the man, so which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? The expert in the law replied, what else could he say? The one who had mercy on him. Jesus said, talk about expanding one's loving of others. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Now again, we don't know a lot about any of these characters in this story, in this parable, right? But I think what we do know is this, about 2 of them in particular, to start with them. We do know, because of what we read here, that both the priest and the Levite have a love for others that is definitely limited in scope. It's definitely finite in its nature. And that while they no doubt certainly love some people, probably those closest to them, probably those who look a lot like them, right? While certainly they've got to love somebody in their lives, for some reason they're not able to move beyond that closed circle and bring that love to everyone. Guys, not so for the Samaritan, right? In that for him, even though this action he takes puts him at risk, never forget in the parable, he doesn't know if the robbers are still around, right? He doesn't know if he's in danger in doing this. Even though this probably puts him in harm's way, even though this costs him financially, right? Even though those things are true, I mean, he takes this action anyway, right? Gut instinct, natural part of who he is. And guys, the more we begin to see that in ourselves, what can we know? New growth in us, springing up. The more we see that in ourselves, the more that signals true growth, especially in the midst of a really difficult place in our lives. Years ago, the Salvation Army was holding an international convention, and their founder, General William Booth, wasn't able to attend because he was sick. Instead of being there to speak, he cabled, this was a while ago, he cabled his convention message to them. It was one word: others. Another great gift that comes along with clearing space for God, not just in our lives, but in our wilderness. Another great gift that comes along with that is this motivation to love more deeply. This motivation to even love more sacrificially. And as you look for new growth within you, Secondly, today, this week, also look for glimpses of an increase in your desire to love others. That will point you to, again, that new growth that needs to be cared for, nurtured. Think about this a bit as we close. While our first step today was to better understand when we're looking for new growth in us, first step today was to better understand how we can best recognize that growth. While that was our first step today, our second step really is this: beginning to nurture that new growth now that we recognize it. And while we're not going to have a list of here are 6 things, 8 things, 10 things that we need to do in order to nurture that new growth, because I want you today and this week to prayerfully consider, okay, I'm seeing that in myself. I've looked at these couple of things we've talked about. There is that new growth. I want you to just prayerfully consider, okay, God, how do I need to nurture it? What's it going to take to nurture it? While we're not going to just list a bunch of things that you can turn to, though we will talk about those on Wednesday at the 10 o'clock Zoom study that we'll have Wednesday morning, what I want to give you today is simply that which is the best foundation for discovering how to nurture what's growing within you. The best foundation is this. The best environment for that kind of nurture is this: having within you a grateful heart. In the midst of that growth, having within you, as you recognize it, having within you just the spirit of deep, deep gratefulness. And again, that's why noticing the new growth in you is so important, because once you begin to see it, having cleared some space for God in your life, once you begin to see those new sprouts cropping up, if gratitude is what strikes you immediately, and that gratefulness then turns into celebration, it's often that celebration then that leads us to this: yearning for more growth, or wanting even more growth to spring up in us. A few weeks ago, we began a journey into our wilderness, and we began that journey so that we might do what? I hope you've been working at this. We began that journey so that we might do what? So that we might clear space for God in our lives, especially where we need Him most. As we journey into another week, my prayer for you is this: that you might now begin to see some new growth in you because of that clearing you've created.